Hello and welcome to our first lesson in the B4 topic. We need to start having a look at how multicellular organisms transport substances around themselves. So we are looking at organisation in animals and plants. Today's first lesson we're going to be looking at the blood. If you look at the screen, there is a starter. This is on the PowerPoint that you've got as well. It says, "Is the blood in your veins blue?" I would like you to pause the video and have a think to yourself what you think. Is the blood in your veins blue? Press play on the video when you're ready to resume. So, regardless of what you thought about this starter, blood inside your veins, inside your blood vessels, is always red. Even though deoxygenated blood is often shown as blue in diagrams. Oftentimes in diagrams you'll see that something called deoxygenated blood is shown as blue, while oxygenated blood is shown as red. This is not strictly the case. Blood is always red, okay? It's never blue. Blood inside us is always red. So today's title, you need to write in your books, please, as you would for any other lesson, Studying the Blood. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify the parts of the blood and their functions. You should be able to explain how the parts of the blood are adapted to do their job, and you should be able to explain the roles of hemoglobin in the blood. So again, this is the start of a new topic. This is the start of B4. In your exercise books, I would like you to write the title, as you would for any other lesson, Studying the Blood, and we're going to be using this online chalkboard for me to write my notes, okay? So, in multicellular organisms, substances need to be transported so that every cell in the organism gets what it needs, okay? In a unicellular organism, it's not a problem because they can just absorb the things they need from their environment by diffusion. In multicellular organisms, it's much more difficult. So I have changed the pen colour to red. As you know from my lessons, that means it's an important point. So we can say in multicellular organisms, so in multicellular organisms, substances need to be transported around, so that all cells have what they need. Helps if I can spell what they need for respiration and to remove waste. So this says, which is a very important thing, that's why I've put in red, in multicellular organisms, substances need to be transported around so that all cells have what they need for respiration and to remove waste. So just to illustrate this a bit more, I want you to imagine that we've got a unicellular organism, okay? So this is our unicellular organism. So unicellular organism. Okay? Our unicellular organism is made of only one cell. This cell needs oxygen so that it can carry out respiration. So it needs oxygen. And it also needs glucose or sugars. Okay, these go in. And again, as I just said, this is really important. It comes up on exam questions a lot. These two things are needed for respiration. So needed for respiration. Okay. At the same time, this cell is going to be producing lots of waste substances. Now, these waste substances can include things like carbon dioxide, and it can include things like urea, which we'll talk about in year 11. These are waste. If you're a unicellular organism, you can just absorb all the oxygen and glucose you need from your environment, and you can get rid of the urea and carbon dioxide into the environment. I should have said oxygen and glucose, sorry, not carbon dioxide. So the cell can take in oxygen and glucose for respiration, and it can give out urea and carbon dioxide as waste. However, if you are a multicellular organism, this becomes a bit more difficult. So if we've got a multicellular organism, which I'm going to draw as these blocks, like so. In fact, what would be an easier way to do it is to just draw a big square and divide it up like so. So this is my multicellular organism. Each one of these squares represents a cell. The reason it's multicellular is because it's made up of more than one cell. It's made up of many cells, which we discussed back in B1. Now, all of these cells still need oxygen and glucose. We still need oxygen and glucose for respiration. And at the same time, all of these cells are still going to be producing urea and carbon dioxide. The problem is that if it relies on diffusion, this multicellular organism, so this is a multicellular organism, if it relies on diffusion alone, the cells on the outside will be fine. They will be able to absorb what they need from the environment and throw their waste out. But the ones in the middle of the organism are going to really struggle. They're not going to be able to get any oxygen. They're not going to be able to get any glucose. They're not going to be able to get rid of any waste because they'll just be pouring it into other cells. For this reason, organisms, multicellular organisms, have transport systems so that they can get all of the oxygen and glucose to every cell for respiration, and so that they can get rid of all the waste. So, if we can just clear the screen and go on to our next point. In humans, in mammals, the blood does this job, and your blood is a tissue. So we can say that, change that to a pen, that the blood is a tissue It is a mixture. It is a mixture of cells, comma, solutes and liquids. Okay, so the blood is a tissue because it's made up of many types of cells working together to do a job, if you think back to when we did that in B3. So we can just underline tissue and put made of lots of cells working together to do a job. So it's a tissue made of lots of cells working together to do a job, and it's a mixture of cells, solutes, and liquids. Remember, a solute, you may wish to write this in your notes, is a substance that cannot dissolve in a solvent. So if we go across to our PowerPoint, if I can go the right way, you can see a diagram like this. And we can paste this on here, make it a bit smaller, because you've got a copy of this anyway. If we were to centrifuge your blood, it would come out like this. You'd get this clear liquid on the top, you'd get a white layer in the middle, and you'd get this red layer at the bottom. This separates your blood into cells. It separates the tissue into the separate cells that it's made of. And this tells us what each part of your blood is made up of. So we can say that blood contains the following parts. Blood contains the following parts. The first one we need to talk about is this one here, the plasma, and it makes up 55% of your blood. So the plasma, and it makes up 55% of the blood, okay? Now, your plasma is the liquid part of the blood that carries waste substances. So the plasma is the liquid part of the blood that carries waste substances like urea and carbon dioxide. Okay? So it's the liquid part of the blood that carries waste substances like urea and carbon dioxide. The red part at the bottom on this diagram is the red blood cells, and that makes up about 45% of your blood. So the next one is red blood cells. Red blood cells. And it makes up 45% of your blood. Now, the red blood cells carry oxygen from the lungs to the body cells. So red blood cells carry oxygen from the lungs to the body cells. So you've got your plasma, which makes up 55%, and you've got your red blood cells, which make up about 45%. Now, the keen-eyed viewers of this would be saying that 55 plus 45 is 100%, but we've still got a bit to talk about. These other two final parts make up less than 1% of your blood. They make up a very, very tiny amount of your blood, so it's hard to quantify them without using decimals. So far we've got that the plasma is the part of the blood that carries waste substances like urea and carbon dioxide. I'm going to underline those because those are very common questions. We've got red blood cells, which carry oxygen from the lungs to the body cells. The next one we need to talk about are white blood cells. White blood cells. So, white blood cells. White blood cells help protect us from infection. So they help protect the body from infection. We'll talk more about those in B6, I think it is. Help protect the body from infections. And the final part that we need to talk about are the platelets. Platelets, okay? Now, these are parts of cells, or parts of dead cells, which allow clotting at wound sites. So when you cut yourself, it's the platelets that cause the cut in your skin to be blocked so that infections can't get into your blood and you stop losing blood, okay? So platelets are parts of dead cells, parts of dead cells which help clotting at wound sites, which help clotting at wound sites. Hope if I could spell sites. So the blood is a tissue. It's a mixture of cells, solutes and liquids. Remember, a tissue is lots of cells working together to do a particular job. The blood contains the following parts. It contains plasma, which is the liquid part of the blood that carries urea and carbon dioxide. Red blood cells, which carry oxygen from the lungs to the body cells. White blood cells, which help fight infections, so they protect us from infections. And the platelets, which cause clotting at wound sites, okay? In your exams, you can be asked, what does the red blood cells do? What does plasma do? Don't just say that the blood carries oxygen. It doesn't. It's the red blood cells specifically that carry oxygen. Don't just say that the blood fights off infections. It's the white blood cells specifically which fight off infections, okay? So if we have a look back at our learning objectives, it says, can you identify the parts of the blood and their functions? The next bit says, can you explain how the parts of the blood are adapted to their job and explain the roles of hemoglobin in the blood? So to do this, I'm going to talk about two things. I want us mostly to focus in on blood plasma first. So the first thing we're going to look at, or the first part we're going to focus on, is the plasma. And the second part we're going to focus on are the red blood cells. And then this lesson will come to an end, because white blood cells will focus on in a later topic, and platelets are just dead parts of cells which stop blood clotting at wounds. Okay? So the first one I'm going to go through relatively quickly. So if we can just make our screen black again so that it's easier to see and draw. The first one I want to go through relatively quickly. We're going to be talking about blood plasma. Okay? Blood plasma. Now, blood plasma, as we just said, it makes up 55% of the blood. So the blood plasma is 55% of our blood. Okay? It's about 90% water. So plasma is 90% water and 10% solutes. 10% solutes. So it contains some dissolved parts, okay? The plasma carries, so plasma carries hormones, it carries antibodies, it carries nutrients, and finally, it carries waste substances. Waste substances. Now, the waste substances that it carries are carbon dioxide, which we've just mentioned, which is taken to the lungs where we can exhale it out. So sent to the lungs. And we've also got a substance known as urea, which is sent to the kidneys so that we can urinate it out. And it'd help if I could spell kidneys. It's with a Y, isn't it? N-E, kidneys, okay? We're going to look at this part at the end of B4, and then we're going to look at this in year 11. So don't worry too much. But for now, you just need to know that it's 55% of our blood, it's 90% water and 10% solutes, and that the plasma carries hormones, antibodies, nutrients, and waste substances such as carbon dioxide and urea. The final bit of this lesson I want to focus on, as I said just, is red blood cells. Okay? So please remember, if I am moving fast, you can always pause the video or rewind if you didn't quite get all the notes down. That's the beauty of this. So the final one we need to look at is red blood cells. Red blood cells, and we're going to spend a bit of time on this. So the first thing we can say about red blood cells is that they transport oxygen. Transport oxygen. So it's the red blood cells in our blood that transport oxygen, okay? In 1 millimeter cubed of blood, there's about 5 million red blood cells. So we can say in 1 millimeter cubed of blood, there is 5 million red blood cells. That's a lot. Okay, so there's lots of them. They're so tiny so that they can pass through something called capillaries, which we'll look at later on in this topic. Okay, so red blood cells are tiny so that they fit through capillaries. Okay, so they're very, very small so that they fit through capillaries. If we pull over to the PowerPoint and I just take this image out, red blood cells have what's known as a biconcave disc shape. Now what that means is that they're kind of like a donut with the middle hole filled in. They get very, very thin to the middle and much wider to the outside, so that we can say that they have a biconcave shape, and this is important because it increases surface area. So they have a biconcave shape which increases their surface area. What this means, a higher surface area, means that they can accept or release oxygen much more quickly. So think of diffusion. Oxygen is going to be taken in by the red blood cell via diffusion. By having a bigger surface area, they can take that oxygen in quicker, and they can give that oxygen to the cells of the body quicker. So we can say, we can just add underneath this one, I'm going to put it in red, that a higher surface area increases the rate of diffusion of oxygen. Okay, so the higher surface area increases the rate of diffusion of oxygen. So they have this biconcave disc which increases their surface area, so diffusion is quicker. We can say that they contain something called hemoglobin. So they contain, oh, need to change the pen back. They contain hemoglobin, and that can be our first keyword, our only keyword. Oh no, we've got two keywords today, but this is the first. So our first keyword is hemoglobin, H-A-E-M-O, globin. Okay, just neaten this A up. Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin can be defined as chemical found in red blood cells. Chemical found in red blood cells which binds to oxygen to transport it around the body. To transport it around the body. So it's hemoglobin which binds to the oxygen. Okay? The final adaptation that red blood cells have, and I'm going to write, in fact, before I do that, we're just going to write an equation before we move on. So hemoglobin binds to oxygen, okay? If we were to write that as an equation, we could have oxygen plus hemoglobin in a reversible reaction. So remember, we draw a two-way arrow like this, like you would in chemistry, makes something known as oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. Okay? Oxyhemoglobin. Okay? Now, oxyhemoglobin is the red substance of the blood. When oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin found in red blood cells, it glows red, making our blood appear more red. Okay? So we can just add underneath this by saying, or we could define oxyhemoglobin. I'm trying to think if I've got enough room. Yeah, we will. So oxyhemoglobin we can define as the bright red substance formed when oxygen binds to hemoglobin in blood cells. Binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells. Okay? So red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which attaches to oxygen. So at the lungs, you breathe oxygen in. The oxygen is picked up by hemoglobin in your red blood cells to make oxyhemoglobin. This oxyhemoglobin goes off to the cells of your body, drops off the oxygen, becoming hemoglobin again. That then goes back to your lungs. You breathe in, you add oxygen to it, that hemoglobin goes round your body to the cells, drops off the oxygen, becoming hemoglobin again. Okay? The final adaptation is that red blood cells have no nucleus. To increase space for oxygen. Help if I can spell for, not of. To increase space for oxygen. Okay? So red blood cells, they're adaptions. They transport oxygen. Their adaptations include, there's lots of them, there's approximately 5 million in every 1 millimeter cubed of blood. They're tiny so that they can fit through capillaries. They have a biconcave disc shape, so that increases their surface area to increase the rate of diffusion of oxygen. And they contain hemoglobin, which is a chemical which binds to oxygen, which then becomes oxyhemoglobin, which allows it to drop the oxygen off to the cells of the body, where it returns to being hemoglobin. Red blood cells also have no nucleus to increase the space for oxygen. A very common 6-mark question is that you can be asked what are the adaptations of red blood cells to allow them to do their job. Everything in orange on here are the adaptations. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those would give you your marks. So if we look back at our learning objectives, it said, studying the blood. Can you identify the parts of the blood and their functions? You should be able to tell me what the plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells and platelets do. You should be able to explain how each part is adapted to do their job. You need to mostly focus on plasma and red blood cells. And you should be able to tell me what hemoglobin does. What I would like you to do now, I would like you please to work through the questions that I've attached in Google Classrooms. They look like this. Once you've done that, each question has the marks or a model answer on the PowerPoint, which is also attached in Google Classrooms. As you would in any other lesson, I would like you to work through the questions, have a go at them, then get a different coloured pen and mark them when you look at the answers. There's lots of different questions there. You've got all the questions. At the end, if you do have time, remember this is only a 50-minute lesson, you should have a go at these questions. If you decide to do that, write out the question in your book, write an answer. Be sure to share all your work with me if you wish. I don't need to see this work that you do in your book. I trust that you are doing it. However, if you want to take a picture of it and add it to Google Classrooms or email it me, I'm sure I can hand out a couple of merits and star awards for people who do very good work. So, that concludes today's lesson, our first lesson on B4, looking at the blood. I will see you next time. Thank you very much. Any questions, please comment in the Google Classrooms or drop me an email.